Welcome to the deep dive. I'm really excited for us today. We're going deep into a really critical chapter of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. This conflict fought out in the jungles of Southeast Asia, well, it just echoed across the entire globe. For the Vietnamese people, it was this ultimate fight for their independence. For America, it really became a defining struggle against what they saw as the spread of communism. And for the world, it ended up being a devastating lesson, really unforgettable about the limits of power. So we've gathered your stack of sources. It's a really comprehensive history, and we're going to use it to guide you through this incredibly complex story. Our mission basically is to pull out the most important pieces, help you understand not just what happened, but crucially why it matters so much and the kind of lasting impact it left behind.
Exactly. And this kind of deep dive lets us synthesize all this diverse information, connect the dots across decades of fighting and really spot the patterns underneath. Understanding this war isn't just about dates and battles. It's actually essential for getting a handle on geopolitical dynamics that are still playing out today. It's a story of resilience, yeah, but also miscalculation, immense suffering, and ultimately enduring change. It holds lessons for all of us, I think.
Okay, so let's start untangling this. Where does the story really begin? Because it's not really the mid 20th century, is it? It goes
Right.
back further, right,
Yeah.
to the 19th century.
That's right. It really kicks off with French colonialism.
Yeah.
Vietnam became part of what was called French Indochina. And for decades, the Vietnamese lived under French rule, their culture suppressed, resources exploited. It was classic colonialism. But resistance was always there, simmering. And into this scene steps a really pivotal figure, Nguyen Sinh Kung, who we now know as Ho Chi Minh. He spent years traveling, time in the U.S., the Soviet Union, absorbing ideas. He came back inspired by Marxism, Leninism, yes, but also a powerful sense of Vietnamese nationalism. His goal, independence.
Okay, and then World War II happens. How did that shake things up? How did it impact this struggle?
Well, during the war, Japan occupied Vietnam, basically pushing the French aside. And it was right then, in that sort of power vacuum, that Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh. This was an armed independence group specifically to fight the Japanese occupiers.
And this is where it gets really fascinating, right? After Japan is defeated in 1945, Hody declares independence for Vietnam. And the incredible part is, he actually quotes America's own Declaration of Independence in his speech. All men are created equal?
It's a powerful moment. But it didn't last. The French came back. They were absolutely unwilling to give up their colony.
And that refusal just lit the fuse, didn't it? It sparked the First Indochina War.
Exactly. From 1946 to 1954, a brutal, relentless conflict.
And France wasn't alone, right? They had significant support from the U.S. waging this war against the Viet Minh.
They did. But what really stands out from that period is the sheer determination of the Vietnamese. Their knowledge of the terrain, their beliefs in the cause, it was unwavering. And this led to that stunning French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Bien Bien Phu, yeah, that was huge.
Absolutely massive. Their fortress, they thought it was impregnable, just collapsed after a 57-day siege. It wasn't just military, it was this huge psychological blow. It really showed the vulnerability of colonial power, resonated across Asia and Africa, fueled decolonization everywhere. So after that, you get the Geneva Conference. The big powers step in, and the decision. Temporarily divide Vietnam, North Vietnam, communist, under Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam, anti-communist, led by Nguyen Ngo Dinh Diem, and crucially backed by the U.S.
Okay, but this division you hear, it was meant to be temporary. National elections were promised to reunite the country. What happened there? Why didn't they happen?
That's the critical point. Those elections, they were never held. The U.S. and Diem feared Ho Chi Minh would win, probably overwhelmingly. So the elections were scrapped. And that decision really set the stage for so much of the conflict to come. The division became permanent, de facto.
So South Vietnam then becomes this key battleground in the Cold War. Tell us about Nguyen Ngo Diem's government there. What was his rule like?
Well, Diem's regime, while definitely anti-communist, was also authoritarian and increasingly corrupt. He alienated huge parts of the population. He persecuted the Buddhist majority, silenced dissent, favored Catholics.
Which create a lot of friction.
A lot of friction, widespread unrest, public anger. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh is consolidating power. He's getting aid from China, from the Soviet Union. And it's during this period that the Viet Cong, the communist insurgents in the south, really begin their campaign against Diem's government. It starts small, but grows.
So with all this instability in the South, what was the American thinking? Why get more involved at this point?
The core U.S. fear was the domino effect. This idea that if South Vietnam fell to communism,
The rest of Southeast Asia would follow, like dominoes.
precisely, that fear drove policy. Eisenhower, then Kennedy, they steadily increased the number of military advisors, poured in financial aid to South Vietnam. Then you have the really dramatic events of 1963. Diem is overthrown and assassinated in a coup the U.S. knew about and arguably supported.
A very turbulent time.
Incredibly. And just weeks later, Kennedy himself is assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson inherits this deeply unstable, rapidly deteriorating situation in Vietnam.
And then just a year later, in 1964, we get this flashpoint,
Okay.
the Gulf of Tonkin incident. What exactly happened there, or what was claimed to have happened?
Right. The claim was that U.S. naval destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, the details of this second alleged attack especially are, let's say, murky, highly debated even today. Some reports suggest it might not have happened as initially described.
But the response was very clear.
Oh, absolutely. Congress responded almost immediately with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And this resolution essentially gave President Johnson, well, what amounted to a blank check. It gave him broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without needing a formal declaration of war from Congress, a huge expansion of presidential power.
So fast forward to March 1965. The first U.S. combat troops land. America is now fully officially at war. How did the U.S. military try to fight this war? What was the strategy?
It was a multifaceted approach. They launched Operation Rolling Thunder, this massive, sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. At the same time, the number of ground troops just soared. By 1968, there were over 500,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam.
That's an incredible number.
It is. But the fighting itself was unlike anything the U.S. military had really experienced before. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics very effectively. Hit and run, ambushes, traps. The dense jungle provided perfect cover.
Making traditional warfare very difficult.
Extremely difficult. And frustrating for U.S. forces. This frustration, combined with the nature of the enemy, led to a reliance on heavy firepower. Search and destroy missions, massive use of artillery, and, controversially, chemical warfare. Things like Agent Orange, a defoliant used to clear jungle cover. We now know it had devastating long-term health consequences for everyone exposed, Vietnamese and American soldiers alike.
And back home in the States, how was all this being perceived? Did the official story match what people were seeing?
That's where a huge gap started to open up. The government, the military leadership, kept insisting victory was just around the corner. Progress was being made. But the media coverage, especially television bringing the war into people's living rooms night after night, showed something very different. It showed the casualties, the brutality, the difficulty.
So people started questioning.
Yes. Doubt grew steadily. And then came the real shock. The Tet Offensive in January 1968. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army launched coordinated surprise attacks across South Vietnam, even hitting the U.S. Embassy grounds in Saigon.
Militarily, the offensive was pushed back, wasn't it?
It was eventually, and at great cost to the attackers. But psychologically, it was a disaster for the U.S. war effort. It completely shattered the narrative that the enemy was weakening and that the end was in sight. Trust in the government just plummeted. Tet was a major turning point in public opinion.
So as the war keeps grinding on, public opinion shifts and protests really start to ramp up back in the U.S. What did that anti-war movement look like?
It became massive and diverse. College campuses were definitely epicenters of protest with teach-ins, marches, demonstrations. You also had disillusioned Vietnam veterans returning home, forming groups like Vietnam Veterans Against the War, speaking out with incredible moral authority about their experiences.
That must have been powerful.
Incredibly powerful. And prominent civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. began condemning the war too. He linked the spending on the war abroad to the lack of resources for fighting poverty and inequality at home. And then there were the images. Certain images just seared themselves into the public consciousness.
Like what?
The photo of the Saigon police chief executing a Viet Cong suspect in the street. The image of the young girl, Kim Phuc, running naked and burned from a napalm attack. These images showed the raw horror in a way words couldn't. They fueled the moral outrage.
The country sounds like it was just tearing itself apart. And that brings us to Kent State University in 1970, a truly tragic moment. What happened there?
It was horrific. During an anti-war protest on campus, Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire on student protesters. 4 students were killed, 9 others wounded. It sent shockwaves across the country. It starkly illustrated just how deep the divisions had become.
Killed by their own country's forces for protesting the war.
Exactly. And then, compounding the sense of moral crisis, the story of the My Lai massacre finally broke. This had actually happened back in 1968, but it took time to come out. It was revealed that U.S. troops had systematically killed hundreds, over 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. Men, women, children, babies.
Unbelievable.
It was a profound shock. It further eroded trust in the military and the government, and raised deep questions about American conduct in the war. It stained the nation's image, both at home and abroad.
So Richard Nixon is elected in 68, partly on a promise of ending the war, achieving peace with honor. What was his actual strategy? How did he plan to get the U.S. out?
Nixon's main public policy was called Vietnamization.
Right. The idea was to build up the South Vietnamese army.
Exactly. Build up their forces, train them, equip them so they could take over the fighting, allowing U.S. troops to gradually withdraw.
But that wasn't the whole story, was it?
Not at all. While withdrawing troops publicly, Nixon secretly expanded the war. He authorized bombing campaigns and ground incursions into neighboring Cambodia and Laos
Why?
to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines,
Yeah.
the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and destroy enemy sanctuaries. But this was done without informing the American public or Congress initially.
And when that came out?
Huge outrage, massive protests, including the ones that led to Penn State. It seemed like a betrayal, widening the conflict instead of ending it. And then adding fuel to the fire came the Pentagon Papers leak in 1971.
Daniel Ellsberg.
Yes. He leaked this top-secret internal Defense Department history of the war. And these papers revealed, in stark detail, how successive U.S. administrations, going back years, had misled the public and Congress about the war's origins, its progress, and the real reasons for U.S. involvement.
Just devastating for public trust.
Absolutely devastating. It confirmed the worst fears of many critics and made it even harder for the government to maintain support for the war effort.
So with Vietnamization, secret wars, leaks,
Mhm.
how did the actual U.S. military involvement finally wrap up?
Well, all this pressure, combined with diplomatic efforts, finally pushed the peace talks in Paris forward. Henry Kissinger for the U.S., Le Duc Tho for North Vietnam. After long, difficult negotiations, they reached an agreement. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973.
And what did the accords say?
Essentially a ceasefire. The U.S. agreed to withdraw all remaining combat troops within 60 days. North Vietnam agreed to release all American prisoners of war.
So the U.S. troops came home. The POWs came home.
Yes, for America, direct military involvement was over. But, and this is critical, the accords left North Vietnamese troops in place in the South.
Yeah.
And the underlying political conflict between North and South Vietnam, it was far from resolved. Peace for Vietnam itself was very fragile.
So the Americans leave in 1973. What happens next in South Vietnam? How long did that fragile peace last?
It didn't last long at all. Almost immediately, the ceasefire started to break down. Fighting resumed. Without direct U.S. air power and massive support, the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, struggled. They were often poorly led, corruption was still rampant, morale was low. North Vietnam, sensing weakness and seeing U.S. aid to the South dwindling, began planning a major offensive.
And that came when?
In early 1975, the North launched what turned out to be the final offensive, and the South Vietnamese resistance just crumbled. City after city fell, much faster than even the North Vietnamese expected. It was a total collapse.
Which leads us to that final iconic moment, April 30th, 1975, the fall of Saigon. Can you paint that picture for us?
It was sheer chaos, desperation. The North Vietnamese army was closing in on Saigon. The U.S. launched Operation Frequent Wind, this massive helicopter evacuation from the U.S. Embassy and other locations.
Those famous images from the embassy roof.
Exactly. Helicopters crammed with American personnel and, crucially, many South Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans and feared for their lives. But thousands more were left behind. Desperate crowds swarmed the embassy walls, people clinging to helicopter skids as they took off. It was a heartbreaking, frantic scene. And then North Vietnamese tanks rolled to the gates of the presidential palace. They raised the Viet Cong flag. The war was over. Vietnam was finally unified under communist control.
It's just an incredibly dramatic and painful end. Let's talk about the cost. The human toll of this decades-long conflict was immense, wasn't it?
Staggering is the only word. The numbers are almost hard to comprehend. Estimates vary, but perhaps as many as 3 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, North and South, were killed.
3 million.
And on the American side, over 58,000 service members died. Millions more on all sides were wounded, physically and psychologically. Beyond the deaths, you have families ripped apart, cities and villages destroyed. The landscape itself poisoned by chemical weapons like Agent Orange.
Those effects are still being felt, right?
Absolutely. Agent Orange caused and continues to cause severe health problems, including cancers and birth defects, affecting generations in Vietnam. The legacy of unexploded ordnance, bombs, and landmines still kills and maims people today. And then there was the refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese fled the country after 1975, many taking to dangerous journeys in small, overcrowded boats.
The boat people.
Yes, seeking safety in refugee camps and eventually resettlement in other countries, including the U.S., and for American veterans returning home. It was incredibly difficult. Many faced public indifference, even hostility. They struggled with PTSD, trauma, addiction, lack of support. The wounds were deep on all sides.
So looking back now, after all that cost, all that upheaval, what is the lasting legacy? How did it change America? How did it shape Vietnam today?
For America, the Vietnam War was a watershed moment. It fundamentally changed how America saw itself and its role in the world. There was a direct political consequence. The War Powers Act of 1973, trying to limit the president's ability to wage war without congressional approval.
A reaction to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Precisely. But maybe more profoundly, it shattered the post-World War II consensus, the widespread trust in government and institutions. It created a generation much more skeptical of official narratives, more questioning of authority. You see its impact on journalism, on activism, even today. The credibility gap became a common term. For Vietnam, obviously, the immediate outcome was unification under communist rule. The decades since have been about rebuilding a nation utterly devastated by war, slowly opening up its economy and navigating its place in the world.
And it is pretty remarkable, isn't it, that today the U.S. and Vietnam have normalized relations. They have diplomatic ties, significant trade.
It is remarkable. It shows how history moves on, sometimes in unexpected ways. But that doesn't erase the past. The memories linger. For veterans on both sides, for families who lost loved ones, for the landscape itself. And the questions remain. Those fundamental questions about the war, its justifications, its costs, they continue to be debated. Was it worth it?
We've certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the early days of French colonialism through Ho Chi Minh's fight for independence, the deepening American involvement, the brutal fighting, the protests back home, the fall of Saigon, and looked at the really profound, lasting legacy.
Yeah, and I think what this deep dive really underscores is just the sheer complexity of history. You see how intentions, ideologies, national interests, and of course countless individual human lives just get tangled together, often in really devastating ways. The consequences just ripple outwards for decades.
So as you, our listener, reflect on everything we've talked about today, here's something to maybe mull over. The story of Vietnam isn't just about a war. It's also about the incredible resilience of the human spirit, isn't it? About the often unforeseen consequences of foreign policy decisions, big and small. And about that constant, difficult challenge of trying to grasp complex historical truths. What deeper questions does this whole story spark for you? About power, maybe. About independence. Or about the real, enduring price of peace.